Hi, thanks so much for letting me be a part of your class.
Thanks, Remi.
And thanks so much for spending time with my work, which of course means everything to a writer. This is my 7-year-old, Evelyn Josephine Hoffman, and she is having trouble getting to bed, so I told her she could be on a movie. All right, now you have to go to bed. Say goodbye. Say
Bye.
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 All right. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to read the work, and also I will say, like, what a lucky class you are for getting to work with Remi, a poet whose work I so deeply admire. So you've been in good hands all semester long, and I hope you go check out Remi's poetry, which you can find a good amount online, and it'll knock your socks off. All right. So let's get on with the questions. I wanted to do a video because if you're like my classes that have gone online this semester, they've just been forced to read more and more and more. Reading so important for writers, but you're probably about at your limit at this point. So a video, you can do your laundry or something while you listen to this. All right, so question one, are your stories mostly based on your experiences or did they just come to you? I like this question because I so wish that a story ever just came to me, which they never do. It seems like they're always so hard won. And I keep a bunch of note cards around my writing desk with just little scraps of ideas, and I always have notes in my phone and such. But I find it really difficult to come up with ideas. So, yeah, they're often based on experiences to some degree. I always like the Henry James quote. He says something to the effect of, try to be the type of person on whom nothing is lost. I think that's some of the best advice any writer could ever get. Just always be picking up the details wherever you can. And he even gives a story of a novelist walking into a room and seeing a woman for just for a glance and getting a whole novel out of imagining what this person's life would be like. So try to be the type of person on whom nothing is lost, and you might get some story ideas out of it. So question two, what is the best way to get your work seen when you are just starting out? A great question. I'm quite a believer in the traditional publication process, which worked well for me. It takes time, I'll say, submitting to literary magazines or like horror, sci-fi, fantasy magazines. They all exist out there, but there's probably going to be a lot of rejection before you start getting your work picked up. But it's worth it. I think that's a great way to get out there, to be using other publishers and editors platforms who have their own Twitter followers and such, and will be sharing your work and singing your praises. Also, editors and agents comb through those magazines scouting for new talent. So I think that's such an important way to go. And then once you get your work picked up and published by a magazine, then also you can share it on social media. And I think Twitter is probably the best way to go for a writer. At least for me, that's where I have the most like actual readers rather than like my mom and people posting like political videos. That seems to be what Facebook is for the most part these days. But I think Twitter is a great place for a writer to go, and I think it's important for writers to be good at social media. As much as I hate that and find it icky and gross, and I don't want to do it, but it's a reality of our time. I think so produce great work, most important, and then seek publication from a journal. And once it gets picked up, share it as much as possible and do a great job with social media. All right, question three. What do you struggle with most in your writing process, and what do you do to overcome this? So this is kind of related to the first question, this idea of coming up with ideas. I find drafting the scariest, most difficult part of the writing process. I love revising, and I'll go over story 20 times before it's done, more than that often, and I really enjoy that process. I love cutting things from my own work that I've produced, but drafting them producing something out of nothing, how intimidating and terrifying I find that process, like that blinking cursor on a blank page that's just taunting me the whole time. So I think that's the scariest part. How I overcome it, I was mentioning before, taking a bunch of notes. Like I try to always keep like note cards around my writing desk, so if I ever get stumped, I can jump over to, or I can look at one of those for a scrap of idea, or go to my phone's notes. I think, Virginia Woolf said, I think she said something like she always had 4 different projects going at the same time. I think that helps too. Like if you get stuck somewhere, jump to somewhere else. Reading helps a ton too, to inspire those drafting ideas. Be inspired by another great author. Um, all right, question 4. What's your favorite topic to write about? Um, I've probably like kind of made my name at this point, writing working class characters and stories about work. I worked construction for 10 years before I started teaching and writing, and that's been an endlessly useful place for me to go for inspiration. I'm really fascinated with trying to break down stereotypes of how we think about working class people and especially people on the job. So construction workers, think of the prejudices in your mind. I've heard plenty, but probably instantly, there's thoughts of like those rough edges, the grittiness, misogyny and sexism and such, and yeah, like that stuff all exists there. And I think that's so important to convey that. At the same time, like I want to show there's also like a lot of camaraderie and acceptance in this world, or there can be in a different kind of way. Also, I want to show like the beauty of like this weird rough language. I think like the trade talk can be turned into like a lyrical kind of poetry if molded just right. Even like I met guys who could swear so beautifully, and I want to try to write those voices from that working class world. But again, I think there's a real problem if one shies away from the gritty, terrible, scary stuff too. I think it's my duty. I think every writer's duty to show the full complexity of the things we write about, to break down stereotypes, never to simply romanticize or villainize. Anyway, that's more than you asked. I'm fascinated by what people do, people's jobs. I find endlessly interesting, and I highly recommend, if you haven't written a story yet about your job flipping burgers or mowing lawns or whatever, like you give it a try. It's probably some fascinating content just waiting for you there. All right, question 5. What does your writing process look like? It's quite messy. I would turn things over and show you my main writing desk over here, but it's like a filthy mess. So I'm not going to do that. I have a standing desk here. There's a shelf. I just built a shelf. I also have a treadmill desk I work on, so it helps me to move around. And like I have some beautiful Eve Tanguy and Kay Sage painting prints behind me to inspire me. Anyway, it's not this pretty. It's much messier. And I think a writer should approach the process like any other job. I don't believe in writer's block, and I don't believe in the muse. I think writing is work, like so many other things, and you just have to come at it every day. So I think giving yourself a regimented schedule is so important, or that's been important to me. In the summers, when I'm not teaching, I write from 9 to 2 every day, and I try to keep that up. My wife is very good about protecting that time, or helping to protect that time, but it's tough. Like I want to go play with Evelyn, so making yourself stay in the room is an important part of for any writer, I think. But I really struggled for the first few years of teaching to find time to write, especially like when you're working a full-time job, or when I'm taking home a stack of papers to grade with me. How do you manage the writing life while you're doing these other things? So a couple of years ago, I started forcing myself to write at least 100 new words every single night. And I do it at night when most of my work is done, after I put Evelyn and my daughter, my 4-year-old Allison, to bed. I sit down and I write 100 new words. That's nothing, right? And that's part of like why I've given myself this really sustainable, easy goal. Anybody, you can write 100 words in, a couple of minutes, right? If you're just cranking things out. So I find if I tell myself 100 words, I often write 2 or 3 or 400 words. But when I give myself the goal, in the past, I've said I'm going to write for an hour every day when I'm working full time, or I'm going to produce 500 words a day, and I just can't keep up with it. But this 100 words, I've been really productive, probably my most productive last 2 years. So I highly recommend it to anybody. Give yourself a sustainable goal and stick to it every day. All right. Question 6, where did the idea for can picking come from? So this one came from my house painting days. There was a guy named Tom, and he was quite a character, an older fellow. He was probably in his 50s when I was in my early 20s, so he seemed ancient to me. But he talked about on the weekends, he would go to the Michigan State University football games, which had like huge crowds, and they'd sneak in after and they'd collect the cans because in Michigan there's a 10-cent can deposit. And he said they'd make a couple $100 doing this. Um, so from that I tried to imagine a scenario. I invented some fictional characters. Some of them are based on people I knew a little bit, kind of a collage of people I knew, and then Tom's process of stealing cans from this stadium. But the plot I invented from there, the language I invented from there. But I got the idea from paying attention, from being the type of person on whom nothing is lost. Even though at the time I wasn't really serious about writing yet, but it really stuck with me. All right, question 7. Did you always know you wanted to be a writer, or one day did you realize, hey, I'm pretty good at writing stories? That's a great question, too. Uh, I was writing and reading early on. My mom would probably take credit for having read me the Narnia books. She always is talking about how she read those to me when I was a little kid, and that's what made me smart. And maybe mom probably had something to do with it. Um, I wrote my first novel when I was 8 years old called Ninja Foxy. It was about my pet dog becoming like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle type of thing. So fan fiction I produced early on. Maybe. So I enjoyed it. English was probably my favorite subject in grade school and high school, but I never thought of myself as a writer then. I was a singer in punk rock bands for about a decade, and so that was most of the writing I would do was like horrible cliched end rhyme lyrics. Um, and maybe that kept me active somewhat, but it took me a while, and I kept resisting it. I started out school as an audio production major, which was a ridiculous field to go into. Like that's all about work experience, not about degrees. At least my teachers told me at the time. And then even when I agreed to the English major that I was doomed to always be, I was sure I was going to be like a critic, which was such an absurd thing. Like I didn't want to be a teacher or an editor or a writer. I wanted to write literary criticism. How absurd is that? And I told an advisor that, and she said, "Why don't you take a creative writing class?" And this was at Western Michigan University. Um, and the first creative writing teacher I had there really encouraged me, and I have him to thank for so much of this. Especially, he really liked my writing about the construction work that I did, and encouraged me down that path. All right, question 8. What do you think of first when writing a story? The characters, plot, or world it is set in? Is it different each time? Oh, that's great. Like it's so hard to track down the genesis point of the story. Um, I tell my intro fiction writing students a great place to start is an interesting character, and then give them a problem, or an interesting character and make them want something, and then like take a risk to get it. And you can get a great story out of this. So I guess, from my own advice as a teacher, I'd say probably character is the best place to start with. And I think it helps once you get out of writing yourself, which I did for many years. My main characters were all, a version of me. None of those stories ever got published. It was once I started like really being interested in other people's lives, like, when I started to tap into my skills of empathy, I guess, which I think all of us writers have to have that, and we have to be compassionate, right? Um, but I started tapping into that and being curious about like what other people's lives must be like to live. And then, so I'd say that's usually where my stories start. I'll say another thing though, work again that I like to write about so much. When I hear about somebody's interesting job, that will often be a starting point too. I'm working on a story about a radio tower repair person, and they climb they have to climb these like 500, 600 feet towers by hand. It takes like hours to climb up these ladders to replace bulbs, and these people are like, who are these people who have no fear? You should watch the videos online, the YouTube videos of like what this view is like from way up high. Anyway, like a job like that is such a fascinating inspiration too. So maybe it's I don't know. Is that world? Maybe that's world a little bit, or like the detail can be a source of inspiration to start. Okay, question 9. Which story that you have written is very special to you? Um, I like that. I mean, here's my cop out answer that probably like they're all pretty special. I think you have to really believe in a story to be able to send it out for publication, and have to love it to a pretty strong degree. Otherwise, you probably shouldn't be sending it out, right? But to answer the question specifically, which you deserve, it's a good question. There was a story I wrote called Building Walls, and it's in my short story collection with Can Picking. And that's the story collection is called 100 Knuckled Fist, and you could find it if you're interested. You don't have to, but it's out there. Um, Building Walls, like writing that story, kind of became what I call it like a nucleus story. Once I figured out that story, I could see the collection of other stories form around it. Like thematically, it's about a bunch of drywall finishers. It's written in a we point of view, like Can Picking. And it really solidified all the themes of the stories, the type of language I was interested in writing in. It really is, well, Jamie Gordon, one of my mentors that Remi might have worked with a little bit as well. But Jamie Gordon accused me of writing an 8-page prose poem. And it might have been that more than it was a story. And she meant that in a good way. But I think, finding that story kind of unlocked the rest of the collection from there. All right, question 10. What are some of your greatest influences? A great question to end on. So I always say Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is my favorite novel. I've read it, I don't know, I've read it a dozen times. I've taught it a few times. And I just think it's a perfect novel in so many ways. It was so good, he could never write another novel. Like, it haunted him. Imagine that, like writing a book so good you could never write another one. It's great. I highly recommend it. He's a master of scene. George Saunders is one of my favorite living writer. He's so funny, and then always like and grotesque and gritty. He writes swearing so well, and he's super funny, but also like so compassionate. He's just one of the sweetest humans, and I think like he so cares about his characters, and I appreciate that. Toni Morrison, everything she's written, I've adored. Like, nobody writes a sentence like Toni Morrison or understands like the complexity and mess of the human experience. So anyway, those are some of the writers. A living one maybe you haven't heard of, Donald Ray Pollock. If you like Chuck Palahniuk, they're actually friends a little bit, or Chuck Palahniuk discovered Donald Ray Pollock. But Don Pollock, I would say, like takes Chuck Palahniuk to an exponential degree of gritty, gross, violence. So if you like gritty and gross and violent, Donald Ray Pollock is for you. In fact, one of his novels is getting made by Hulu into a movie, I think, right now. But I'd highly recommend him too. Oh, I should mention one more. Greatest influence, Studs Terkel, who's a journalist from Chicago. He died fairly recently, but he has this great book called Working that he put out in the 60s, and it's just interviews with it's dozens of interviews with working people, cab drivers, nurses, doctors, police officers, construction workers, prostitutes, nuns, and such. And it's just a fantastic book of real people's voices, and to hear like the language of work, and that is gorgeous. That's kind of like, I call it my Bible, and it does sit by my writing desk to remind me like what it truly means to work in America. Anyway, I highly recommend that. If you're ever curious for any follow-ups on any of this stuff, feel free to contact me. You can let Remi know you'd like to get in touch, or you can email me at dustin.m.hoffman1 @gmail.com, or find me on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or all that, whatever, that stuff. But I'm always happy to answer questions or to, if you need like recommendations for magazines to submit to, I have lists that I give my students of like magazines that take free online submissions and ones that I really respect and admire. Anyway, anything I can do to help out, especially with the class who took some time to sit with my work, I'd be happy to. So, all right, thank you for listening to this. Hope you got some laundry done. Take care. Stay in touch.